I'm super excited to post this video because it's really good. I really love this fanfiction. The author's amazing. Go check them out because we love authors in this community. And the link to this fanfiction as well as the music and if there are any sound effects in this video will all be linked in the description below. That is a mouthful. Also, if you have any fanfictions that you would like to request or you'd like to see on this channel, just go to the Discord that is also linked in the description below and just leave a link so I could go read it and see if I can post it on the channel. I'll ask the author and they'll be like, yeah or no, and then I'll tell you. All right. Well, yeah, that's all I got. I hope you guys enjoy. This is a long fanfiction, so get your snacks, get cozy, and here we go. You stared at yourself in the dressing room mirror, adjusting and readjusting the straps of the short floral dress. Truthfully, the dress fit perfectly, but you still couldn't seem to get comfortable. A frustrating sigh fell from your lips just before the curtains to the dressing room flew open, causing you to squeal. Give a girl some privacy, would ya? You huffed once your eyes adjusted to Angelina's beaming face. Oh please, you're completely dressed. She rolled her eyes lightly. Speaking of, I love that dress on you. Really? You turned back once again, prepared to give yourself another once-over in the mirror. Angelina offered you a nod in response, then without a warning, began to strip down to her bra and underwear and tug the maroon dress she had brought in over her head. You scoffed and averted your eyes, only to hear Angelina giggle softly behind you. Years of Quidditch and changing freely amongst teammates had made her entirely unashamed. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for you. Shyly, you faced your body away from hers and began to pull the dress off of you. The next thing you had to try on was a red bathing suit, one that Angelina had picked out, of course. When you had it fashioned on firmly, you gazed at yourself in the mirror. You looked good. Like really good. Still, you felt anything but. Another sigh left your lips, which seemed to be a reoccurring theme of the day. Maybe I shouldn't go, you breathed out, meeting Angelina's eyes in the mirror. We are not discussing this. She shook her head quickly. You've already paid. It's been planned for months. You're going. But it's going to be so awkward, you whined, finally turning to face her full on. You know George would never let things be awkward, she argued as she placed her hands on her hips. You loved Angelina. You truly did. But you knew arguing with her always ended up pointless. Besides, you're really going to miss out on an opportunity to show off everything he's been missing. Even if you didn't want to admit it, she had a point. You were far from a prideful person, but who wouldn't want their ex to see them glowing post-breakup? Maybe it was wrong. Maybe it was some faulty bit of your brain that craved the validation of proving yourself to him, but you couldn't help it. You bit down on your lip and pondered her words for a moment, before eventually giving in with a roll of your eye. You're right, you muttered softly, avoiding her gaze. Always am, Angelina quipped back. Now get changed and grab that swimsuit and dress. George Weasley isn't going to know what hit him after seeing you in those. It was a week later as you nervously picked at your cuticles to avoid eye contact with everyone around you. When everything had been planned, a group vacation felt like the much-needed escape you had been longing for. Now, it was plaguing you with more anxiety than work or the general qualms of life ever could. Angelina was at the front desk of the resort, checking everyone in and gathering the keys. The rest of you, which included you, Fred, George, Alicia, and Lee, were partaking in a bit of small talk. Everyone but you seemed to have a bright smile on their face, excitedly awaiting what the rest of the week away would bring. Unbeknownst to you, George too lacked any sort of visible excitement, as his eyes couldn't seem to leave your figure, or the way you were partaking in that old nervous habit of yours. He hated to see you so visibly distressed, but what he hated even more was knowing that he was the cause of your unease. Got him! Angelina announced brightly as she returned to the group. In her hand, she dangled 3 room keys in the air. You reached your hand forward to retrieve one right at the same time George did, resulting in the two of you brushing hands. You quickly withdrew your hand, and you didn't miss the pained expression that crossed his face from you doing so. It made you feel awful, truthfully, but you couldn't help it. You just weren't prepared to be near him, to touch him so soon. Eager, are you? Fred attempted to lighten the situation, but you only could muster the energy to offer him a small grimace in response. Angelina rolled her eyes lightly before handing you a key, then Alicia one, then tucked the final one in her pocket. Your brows furrowed at her actions, and you found yourself glancing anxiously between Alicia and Angelina. Why'd you give me and Alicia both the key? The question was somewhat rhetorical because you feared you may already know the answer. Your stomach was in knots at just the prospect. I just figured You paused to gesture between you and Alicia. Would share a room, and George and Lee would share one. Of course, this trip had been planned long in advance, well before your and George's untimely breakup. At the time, it had only been logical that you and George, and Angelina and Fred, the two couples, would have their own rooms, while Lee and Alicia shared one with 2 beds in it. You hadn't thought to clarify the change in plans before coming. You had just hoped it would be obvious. There was no way you could share a room with George for a week when the wound of your failed love was still so fresh. Sorry, dollface, Lee grinned at you. But I don't share beds. I'm a kicker. That's fine. You hurriedly shook your head. George can just take Alicia's single bed, and me and her can share the double. Actually... Alicia paused to let out a small cough. Bad timing, babe, but I think I might be coming down with something. Wouldn't want to get you sick. You narrowed your eyes at your friend. The two of you had known each other long enough to know that she was most definitely lying. Your mind was in overdrive trying to come up with the best way to nicely insinuate that she most certainly wasn't sick. But George spoke up before you had the chance. I can just take the floor. It's fine. His voice was soft and there was an undeniable trace of pain behind it. Your eyes found his for the first time, and you felt as though your heart was breaking all over again. The worst part about your breakup had been the fact that it wasn't born out of some explosive fight or some lack of love. The two of you had just gotten too caught up in your own work lives and fell out of touch with communication. In the end, you both agreed you still loved one another, but you felt too far apart to fight for what you once had. You had both hoped to remain friends, but doing so ended up being harder than you expected. Alright. Your voice was soft, just as it had been in the end. That's fine. With that, Angelina wordlessly led the group of you towards the elevator. It was most of your first time spending so much time amongst Muggle amenities, but Angelina had done her research. She had almost every day of the trip packed with sightseeing and activities, all to give you the experience of what a true Muggle holiday would be like. At about a year past the end of the war, this was exactly what all of you needed. After arriving on your floor, you headed down the long hallway in search of your rooms. Lee and Alicia's was right next door to Fred and Angelina's, while you and George were across the hall from them. Silently, you turned the key into the door and pushed it open. You could feel George's presence behind you, but neither of you could find the words to speak. Once your eyes adjusted to the bright light spilling in, you let out a small gasp in awe. It was beautiful, truly. A bathroom sat to your left, but further in the room laid a queen-size bed, a television sat before it, then large sliding glass doors that led you to the balcony overlooking the ocean. You sat down your bags and made your way to the door, unlatching the hook before stepping out and breathing in the warm, salty air. Bet they're all jealous we got the room with the view, George joked lightly as he came out to stand beside you. You simply hummed in response, keeping your eyes trained outward. George let out a soft sigh before facing his body towards you. Look, MC, I don't want this whole trip to be weird. I don't want that either. Your voice was quiet as you forced yourself to look at him. Then let's just, be friends for the next 7 days, like we used to be. If you want to go back to not speaking after, I completely get that. But can we just try? For now? You bit down on your lip as you weighed your options. Just being this close to him was excruciatingly hard. But what other choice did you have? There was no point in making things awkward for everyone else, or ruining the trip, so you'd have to agree. Okay. You finally nodded and extended out your hand. Friends. Friends, he grinned at you. The same signature grin that had always made your heart race. God, Rick, the next 7 days would be hard. A little over an hour later, you found yourself on the beach with the rest of the group. You had put on the red swimsuit that Angelina urged you to buy, and had gotten a little bit of the validation you craved when George's eyes widened at the sight of you. Now, though, all you could focus on was the pit of nerves forming in your stomach. Number 1 on Angelina's itinerary of things to do was paddleboarding. You had asked Alicia to share a board, to which she swiftly declined, leaving you to share with George. Although the place you had rented the boards from had given you instructions on how to stand up on the board and all the safety requirements, it seemed almost no one listened. The group of you hadn't even been out for more than 5 minutes before Fred was tumbling off the board, effectively flipping Angelina into the water as well. "You prat!" Angelina screeched when she breached the surface. Fred was laughing uncontrollably as he tried to coax Angelina into his arms, which only resulted in her splashing him. "Reckon we'll be best at this," George spoke to you confidently. Before you could stop him, he was swiftly raising to his feet, causing the board to wobble slightly. You squealed, but ultimately calmed when the rocking ceased. "See? I'm a natural at this." "Think I'll just stay down here for a bit." You glanced over your shoulder at him. You were still on your knees, certain if you tried to stand up, the two of you would end up in a similar situation as Fred and Angelina. "Oh, come on," George whined. You looked up at him defiantly, only to find an ever-familiar mischievous glint now in his eyes. "If you don't get up, I suppose I could just..." And without finishing his sentence, he widened his stance and began rocking the board slightly. "George!" you yelped, grabbing desperately to the sides of the board. Fine, I'll get up." A triumphant grin found its way to his face as you scrambled to your feet, doing your best to keep your balance. When you wobbled slightly, George's hands found their way to your waist, steadying your movements. "I've got ya," he chuckled, causing your face to flush. You were thankful your back was now to him, because the last thing you wanted was for him to see the effect he still had on you. To your left, Lee had now purposefully flipped their board as well. Alicia was fuming as she tried to hoist herself back up onto the board, only to slip back into the water from Lee moving it. You and George made eye contact as you watched your friend struggle, immediately bursting into a fit of laughter. For about another hour, it went on this way. George never flipped your board despite multiple teasing threats that he was going to, and for that, you were thankful. When it was about time to turn the boards back in, Fred had the idea to race back to the shore. Unlucky for you, the twins were pretty competitive, so you had to take this seriously for George's sake. Lee and Alicia didn't stand a chance, what with him constantly laughing, leaving you two neck and neck with Fred and Angelina. Just before you reached the shore, you got an idea. You paused your paddling and glanced back to wink at George, who was looking at you confused. "Oh no, Ange! Your bikini top came undone!" you shouted, clamping a hand over your mouth. "What? No, it hasn't!" She was about to argue, but the damage was already done. Fred had faltered in his movements, quick to help and probably ogle his possibly exposed girlfriend. The both of them furrowed their brows and looked back over at you for an explanation. But it was too late. You and George had breached the shore. George was quick to scoop you up in his arms and spin you around once you both hopped off your board. You squealed triumphantly in his arms, ignoring Angelina and Fred's protest that you had cheated. "We always did make a good team, you know," George spoke up once he had placed you back on the ground. You couldn't deny the butterfly is now swarming in your stomach, and you had to force yourself to look away from him to calm your nerves. Although that was most definitely cheating, Fred huffed as he arrived on the shore. Gotta give you points for acting, MC. Well played. Thank you, you dramatically bowed, a grin plastered on your face. What do you say if we head back and get cleaned up before our dinner reservations? Angelina suggested, to which you all agreed. The boys began dragging the boards back to the beach rental, while you, Angelina, and Alicia began to make your way towards the resort. They squished you in the middle of them, linking their arms with yours, before shooing one another small smirks. I know what you two are doing, you sighed. You're trying to get us back together, but it's not going to happen. I don't know, Angelina replied in a sing-songy voice. You guys looked awfully cozy on your board, and on the beach. Because we decided to be friendly, for the sake of the trip, you retorted. I'm sure that's all that was, Elisa chirped in, a knowing smile on her lips. You simply groaned in response. With whatever else these two held up their sleeves, you were sure this was going to be a long trip. 2 days later, the group of you found yourselves at the Muggles Festival. The air was cool and the crowds thick, but you couldn't be more happy. You skipped excitedly ahead of the group, a bag of candy floss in your hands. The stuff was so sugary it hurt your teeth, but you couldn't find it in you to care. Oh, let's go to that one! Alicia pointed excitedly ahead of you, gesturing towards the large Ferris wheel. You all agreed and made your way towards the ride, tickets in hand. The line was long, but none of you had any problem waiting and chatting idly. When you guys were finally next in line, the worker asked how many were in your party, before ultimately informing you that it was 4 people per booth. Your stomach flipped as you saw a mischievous glint light up in Angelina's eyes before turning back to the worker. Alright, it will be the 4 of us in one, and the 2 of them in another, she pointed to you and George. You narrowed your eyes at Angelina, but ultimately knew there was no point in arguing and making a scene. The 4 of them climbed into the first booth, while you and George waited silently for the next one. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, and the distance between you was noticeable. The ride held pretense for romance and alone time, and you were suddenly worried that it would be terribly awkward. Alright, in you go. The worker pointed ahead after the next booth came to a halt. George held your hand to help you steadily step in before climbing in behind you. You both took a seat across from one another, unnervingly silent as you trained your eyes anywhere but each other. When the ride stopped again to let the next group of people on, George finally spoke. If I didn't know any better, I'd say they've been trying to get us alone together. You're just catching on to that, are you? You snorted, a small smile finding its way onto your face. I've had a guess ever since Fred said he couldn't sit by you at dinner because the air was too drafty. He grinned back. They truly are insufferable, aren't they? You giggled. But you have to commend their efforts. Yeah. George hummed in agreement, idly glancing around as the ride began to move. When he looked back at you, he had a devilish smirk on his face, one that told you he had an idea. What do you say we get back at them? What do you have in mind? Your heart leaped at the idea of being reeled into one of George's pranks for the first time in months. George leaned forward and began to whisper in your ear, the smile on your face upturned as he revealed his plan. It was good, as his pranks often are, and you found yourself giggling as you nodded along in agreement. Certainly, this will get them off your backs. When your booth came to a halt and it was time to get off, you spotted your 4 friends waiting on you with smirks on their faces. You lightly rolled your eyes before turning your attention back to George and raising your eyebrows as if to ask ready. He nodded in response, and your plan was set into motion. I cannot believe you, Weasley! You screeched, all eyes on you, which normally would have made you nervous, but the payoff for this should be significant enough to make it worth it. You are an insufferable selfish git! You climbed out of the booth and began marching away, but George was hot on your heels. The looks on your friends' faces had quickly morphed into one of shocked horror, and it took everything in you not to burst into a fit of giggles.
And you're a swotty know-it-all! I don't even know how I stayed with you for so long!
Once you were out of the way of the line, you paused to turn on your heel and point an accusatory finger towards him.
Yeah, me either!
He threw his arms in the air.
You always try to make me the bad guy, even after you cheated on me with Goric Ollivander!
You shot George a bewildered expression, not expecting him to take that turn, but he slyly sent you a look that read, "Just go with it." Listening in, you could hear your friend's horrified whispers from behind you.
MC slept with Ollivander. Isn't he married? Jeez, never would have guessed she was into older men. Yeah, well, maybe if you actually knew how to play.
Guys, cut it out, you're making a scene. Angelina swiftly cut you off and rushed forward, placing a hand on your shoulder. You shot George a small wink before turning to face Angelina and the others, and you suddenly couldn't hold it in any longer. Both of you burst into fits of laughter, only furthering your friend's confusion. Fred seemed to be the first one to catch on, and he crossed his arms over his chest before rolling his eyes.
Ha ha, very funny, guys. I'd say that was some of our best work.
You nudged George with your elbow before a few more chuckles left your lips. Although I'm not sure why, of all the people you could have said, you chose bloody Ollivander.
He was the first person that came to mind.
George laughed, putting his hands up in defense.
You really should be an actress, MC,
Lee grumbled. You beamed at him triumphantly in response. Hopefully this will teach you lot your lesson to stop meddling, you shrugged. All of your friends grunted in agreement, still mortified by your outburst and the many eyes that had been on you. Still, you find that once their initial fears had worn off, they were far from stopping their efforts to push the two of you together. The final days of the trip seemed to go by in a blur. You and George had taken to alternate between who would sleep on the floor, which only seemed fair. The dread you had been filled with at the beginning of the trip had subsided significantly, leaving you extremely glad that Angelina had convinced you to come. Some part of you even thought there may be a chance you and George could be friends again when you return home. Additionally, each day the group had made it their mission to get you and George alone in some capacity, whether it be leaving you alone together on the beach, or heading to bed early so you and George would be left to retreat to your shared room alone. It didn't matter. You couldn't exactly complain though, because now that the awkwardness had subsided, being in George's presence lit something aflame within you. It was terrifying, the feelings you had worked so hard to leave behind all bubbling up within you once again, especially when you were so certain that he wanted nothing more than to be friends. Which now left you the night before you were set to go home, slightly buzzed from the many flutes of champagne you had ordered from the resort open bar. Fred and Angelina were a lot more than buzzed, and you couldn't help but giggle as you watched them sway dramatically on the outdoor patio, their love-stricken energy pulling a few other couples to dance as well. Lee and Alicia had kicked off their shoes and were wandering down to the beach, leaving you and George, once again, alone. You hummed idly to the soft music playing, letting your eyes drift closed as the sounds around you interchanged with the crashing of the waves. George had his eyes set on you, although you didn't know it, and the smallest of smiles had found its way onto his face. You weren't sure if it was the alcohol thrumming through you or the calming sounds of the ocean, but you suddenly found yourself wanting nothing more than to crash in the bed that was waiting for you inside. You let out a soft yawn, causing George to chuckle, before sleepily opening your eyes and gazing at him.
You wanna head up?
He offered.
I think I might.
You nodded, beginning to slowly stand. But you can stay down here. I'll be okay.
Nah, I'm ready to head for bed soon too.
George stood as well and offered his hand out to you, which you bashfully accepted. As the two of you walked off, you glanced back once over your shoulder, only to find Angelina and Fred silently cheering you on, goofy smiles lit on their faces. You brushed them off with a light roll of your eyes, but the sheepish smile on your face was undeniable. Once you were back in your room, you quickly claimed the bathroom to change out of your dress and into your pajamas. When you exited the bathroom, you found George shirtless, his checkered pajama bottoms hanging low on his waist. The sound of you gulping caused his head to snap up and meet your eyes. Perhaps you were drunker than you thought, because you found yourself almost certain that you had seen him blush under your gaze. To break the awkward tension, you hurriedly bounded towards the bed and jumped onto it while George pulled his shirt over his head. You patted the spot next to you, beckoning him over, which caused him to grin. "Wanna watch something for a little?" you suggested as he sat down on top of the covers next to you. He nodded in response, propping the pillows up behind him so he could rest comfortably against the headboard. You grabbed the remote from the nightstand and began flicking through the channels, entirely unfamiliar with Muggle television and going completely by which title sounded the most interesting. You finally settled on The Silence of the Lambs, which you very quickly learned was not a lighthearted movie about the fluffy Muggle animal. It wasn't long before you were under your covers and had them drawn up to your chin, completely terrified by the horrific things some writer thought to put in the movie. It wasn't exactly a jump scare sort of movie, but it left you completely terrified and uneased. Still, you were too enraptured to change the channel. At some point, you had put your hand down to help yourself sit up better, only to brush against George's hand beside you. You almost recoiled, but then his pinky was hooking around your own, and you thought better of it. That was a friendly thing to do, right? It didn't mean anything more. It wasn't weird. It was just two friends comforting each other in some small way during a horror movie. Right? The two of you stayed like that for some time, until the movie finally ended and you realized you had to put an end to your small touching. You clicked the screen off before another movie could start and bit down on your lip before glancing at George. "You can sleep up here tonight, if you want," you offered. "I mean, it's the last night and all. It only seems fair that we both spend it comfortably up here."
"Right. Yeah, that makes sense," George nodded.
So with that, you were flicking off the bedside lamp and finally pulling your pinky from his, prepared to get comfortable on your side. George turned on his side as well, so that the two of you were facing one another. For a few moments, neither of you shut your eyes or spoke. You just gazed quietly. The soothing sounds of the ocean worked to calm the nerves in your stomach.
"Did you have a good trip?"
George questioned softly. His eyes flickered over every inch of your face. You were bathed in moonlight, and he was certain he had never seen anything more beautiful.
"I did,"
you whispered back, your eyes tracing his face as well.
"I don't think I want to go back to reality tomorrow." "Me neither."
The two of you were quiet once again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the many nights when things were right between you two, that you had basked in the absolute bliss of just being in one another's presence. But now, you were friends, and friends didn't stare at each other so intensely for so long. Just as you were about to speak up and point that out, he slowly extended out his arm and brushed some of your hair out of your face. His hand lingered there after he had tucked it behind your ear, then paused. It was like he was waiting for you to make the next move, to brush him off if that's what you wanted. But that wasn't what you wanted. So you lurched forward and pressed your lips to his. He responded almost instantly, his lips molded against yours in that perfect way that only he knew how. His hand slid down your face to rest on your hip, his thumb just barely brushing up under it and against your bare skin. His touch alone made you shiver, and you had to pull back briefly just to make sure this was real. It wasn't long before things progressed significantly, and it wasn't until both of your clothes were completely forgotten that you found yourself internally questioning what you were doing and what it meant. But as he pressed his lips to yours and whispered your name like it was the only thing in the world that he was certain of, your worries melted away, at least
For tonight, you had each other. You awoke the next morning with a pounding headache, the kind you always got after a few glasses of champagne. You found yourself wanting to groan, but stopped yourself when you realized you were wrapped up in George's arms, still naked from the night before. You sat up quickly, causing George to stir and groggily sit up as well. In his morning haze, he had a sleepy smile as he gazed at you, and it took everything in you not to reach out and fix his messy morning hair. Once he finally processed the immense worry behind your eyes, his mouth fell into a frown and he rubbed at his eyes. Something wrong? Yeah, George, I'd say something's wrong, you scoffed, quickly getting up and looking for your clothes. What the hell were we thinking? We finally got to a place where we were okay with being friends, and then we just completely destroy it. He was silent as you picked up your discarded pajamas and began to tug them on. When you'd come across one of his articles of clothing, you'd ball it up and throw it towards him, feeling nothing but anger at your lack of self-control and at his charm. God, Rick, I'm so stupid. I should have never come on this bloody trip. I should have just stayed home. I spent so much time picking out the perfect outfit to make you notice me, to be something you'd miss. No wonder this happened. You did what? You hadn't even really processed your own ramblings, but his question caused you to freeze. You straightened up, your back towards him, and let out a soft sigh. You're not over me. It was clear he meant for it to be more of a statement, but the uncertainty in his voice almost made it sound like a question. No, George, I'm not, you scoffed again, still unable to turn and meet his eyes. And that's why what happened last night should have never happened. I should have never put myself in a position to be hurt again. I don't want to hurt you. His voice was soft. I've never wanted that. You shuddered at his sincerity, but the sentiment did little to help. Whether he wanted to hurt you or not, you were hurting. And that may not entirely be his fault, but it was the truth. We should just pack up and go, you spoke again after a few moments. Everyone will be down in the lobby in a little bit anyways. But I want to talk about this, he pleaded, now standing to tug on his boxers. What's there to talk about, George? You finally spun around, your hands thrown in the air. Last night was a mistake, a colossal one. So let's just go back to how things were before we even came on this trip, yeah? George looked visibly shocked by your words, so much so that he didn't speak up. You stared at him for a moment longer before grabbing your wand from your suitcase, since you hadn't used it since you got there, and began using magic to repack your bags. George seemed frozen for a moment, and it wasn't until you stormed into the bathroom that you finally heard his voice. It wasn't a mistake for me. You paused, letting the toiletries you were about to pack up clatter to the ground. Your grip on your wand loosened, then you slowly made your way out of the bathroom to look at him. It wasn't a mistake. He shook his head. I've missed you more than I thought it was possible to miss someone. He took a step closer to you, taking it as a good sign when you didn't flinch away. I know we thought splitting up was a good idea, but darling, we were so wrong. I'd rather fight for us every day than ever try again with someone else. You don't mean that. Your voice was quiet as you tried not to get your hopes up. You just think that because of what happened last night, and because this past week has been fun. When we get back home, you're just going to realize that you don't want me again. No. His voice was soft as he now stood right before you and gently reached his hand out to cup your face. I've missed you since the second we decided to call things off. And I know I should have fought for you then, but I'll fight for you now. You trembled slightly at his words, but still you found yourself leaning into his touch. You wanted nothing more than to give yourself over to him, completely. But you were scared. You are worth fighting for, and I'm sorry I ever made you think differently. His thumbs traced up and down your cheekbone. But I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, if you'll let me.
There was a moment of tense silence as you squeezed your eyes shut, letting your nerves be calmed down by his touch. Slowly, you reached your hand up and placed it over his own, before turning and placing a gentle kiss to his palm. Your eyes fell back onto him as he anxiously awaited your response. Okay, let's work on us. And before you knew it, you were wrapped tightly in his arms. You knew you both had a lot to work on to make things right, but you were ready for it. If it meant having him at your side again, it was worth it. When you met with the others down in the lobby, their faces morphed from slightly hungover grimaces to beaming smiles at the sight of you and George hand in hand. Brad and Lee whooped while Alicia and Angelina shot you knowing smirks, causing you to lightly roll your eyes. George offered to take your bags and load them in the taxi, leaving you for a moment alone with your two best friends. They waited anxiously for you to spill everything, but you didn't want to just yet. For a little bit, you wanted what happened to be just between you and George. Still, Angelina nudged you with her elbow and grinned.
You can always thank me later.